This
group.
conference will now be recorded.
I've had the ability to practice sport law for close to 20 years across the country, from little organizations to the Canadian Olympic Committee and everybody in between. It's pretty rare where I get a query where I kind of shake my head and said, I haven't heard that one before, but it still does happen on a regular basis. We are really proud of our little shop. We started 30 years ago, and I've had the ability to expand our team to 14, and everybody that you see before you comes in with a different skill set. If you haven't been to our website, please check it out. It's sportlaw.ca, and you can have this presentation, as well as I'll post my contact information at the end. So please don't feel you have to write everything down. You can definitely have this. And me personally, athlete, coach, official, and now consultant in multiple different sports, and still like to think of myself as an athlete in some way or another, but it's getting a little harder to jump as high as I used to, but I'm still trying. So what did we want to do today is talk about concussions and concussion management. And as Shelley said, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Or if you're not comfortable asking your question in a public setting, feel free to pop an email to Shelley or I, and whoever you feel comfortable talking to, and we'll try and get an answer for you. I want to give you a bit of an understanding of the tort of negligence, which is really the legal principle to which we would see from a liability perspective under which a concussion litigation would occur. And of course, you've seen it in football and in the NHL and those high impact sports where they're saying to the organizations, hey, you've put me into this situation where I'm getting concussions and long-term brain damage, and you should have known better. Now I want millions of dollars to offset that. And really, I want to give you the test that would lead to that particular issue. I want to talk about Rowan's Law, which is a unfortunate story of a rugby player, and I'll get a little bit more into that shortly. And rather than her parents suing everybody who was involved in her case, they actually lobbied for change. And Rowan's Law was the first concussion legislation embedded in Canada. It's in Ontario, and we'll walk through that. It really sets a very high standard for concussion management, and then talk about the different roles and responsibilities that are being emulated across the country. And most of you, if you do want further resources on concussion management, you should be looking at Parachute Canada. They are I'll say the standard in Canada. They spend a lot of effort on this particular area. And then of course we can have some discussions. I want you to think about negligence as a 4-part test. And you see the 4 parts of that test before you. In order to say that you should have done something different or you should have done something better, requires you to answer to the 4 questions before you, yes. And if I have the ability to say no to one of these questions, then I'm not liable. And I want to say this very much at the beginning. Not liable means from a legal perspective. There's also, of course, that ethical perspective where we care for our athletes or anybody who we're involved with who has a concussion. And we want to make sure that they're healthy, they're okay, and that they have the ability to live their lives. I'm sure if you've known anybody who's had a concussion, you know how severe they can be, how they can impact a person's livelihood or life for that matter. One client of mine, their executive director, total coincidence, their son had a chin-up bar, and as she was walking under that bar, it fell on her head, and literally for the next 2 years could not look at computer screens, ended up having to stay in dark rooms quite often, and obviously was not a very comfortable position, let alone from a health perspective, but from a work perspective. So of course, really, again, fundamentally, we want to make sure our people are in the best place possible. So I need to be able to say yes to be legally responsible. So do I owe a duty of care? And we'll talk about all of these in depth, except for probably the last 2. Do I owe a duty of care? Yes. Did I breach my standard of care? Yes. Was there harm or loss? So if you get a bonk in the head and there are no symptoms, no illness, no anything, there's no liability. Was there harm or loss, something to which could be compensated by money? And if the answer is no, I've said no. And of course, the loss or harm has to be correlated to my duty of care and the breach of that duty of care. So again, if I can say no to one of these questions, even though there's damage, even though someone might get hurt, I'm not liable. In sport, duty of care is very, very simple in my mind. To whom do we know could be affected by our actions? Coaches, athletes, club participants, host organizations, participants. We need to create a safe environment. Do we owe those people a duty of care? Like I said, in sport, to say no to that first part of the test is usually very difficult. In standard of care is a very difficult concept to understand. Now that's a picture of my son when he was 3 years old, and that's how we managed standard of care in our house. Was we would just wrap him up in equipment, and Joshua, you can take that philosophy and apply it to your daughter, no problem. And creating a standard of care is what are we obliged to do to create a safe environment, and figuring out where that line is. Is it really high? Is it really low? Is it somewhere in the middle? Is a bit of a challenge. And what we do is we look at these 4 things to help us decide where that line is. I'll start at the bottom, and I'm going to move around here. I'm going to start with common sense. Is this a good idea, what we're doing? Does your gut, your intuition, your knowledge say this makes sense? And if the answer is no, you shouldn't be doing it. And I love sharing this story. Hi, Steve. We're going to California for a competition. Do we need chaperones? Well, how old are the kids? 14. Do you have kids? Yes. How old? 13. Would you send your 13-year-old to California without a chaperone? The answer was no. Well, there you go. That's your common sense intuition. The unwritten and unpublished standards are trends in the industry. What's happening in the world of pentathlon, particularly in Canada? What standards of safety are being put in place in Nova Scotia? Are they same in Ontario as they are in BC? And if they're not, we need to know why. Because truthfully, I'm going to pick on the 20 of you on the call today, and those who aren't. We set the standard. We set the standard. Because people like me who know very little about the sport of pentathlon, we don't set the standards. You do. By establishing trends in the industry. What's a coach-athlete ratio? What are the safety protocols that you implement to make a safe environment? And if we're doing it differently across the country, it creates a bit of liability or insecurity for all of us. And we had talked about Safe Sport last month, and we really are advocating for consistency across the country. We're calling them pan-Canadian policies, pan-Canadian practices, because being a good person in Nova Scotia should be the same as in BC. And same thing from a risk perspective. So find out what other people are doing in pentathlon. Let Shelley centralize it and share that information on behalf of Pentathlon Canada. Your written standards are a lawyer's dream. I'm looking for a prop here. Shelley, it says here that you're going to have 2 coaches for every 10 athletes, and you're going to have them educated on safety protocols. Did you do that? And it's right here in the manual. And if Shelley says no, that's going to be a very slam dunk for me. So those equipment standards, organizational policies, coaching manuals, follow them. And if you can't follow them, you need to talk to your provincial or territorial body. You need to talk to Shelley at Pentathlon Canada. Because if I have a document says that you will do this, you will, should, must be doing this. So really understand your written regulations. I'm going to walk us through the case law now to try and give you a better understanding. There's a 1981 case, and I recognize that's 40 years ago now, which is crazy. But it was about a 15-year-old boy who dismounted a set of rings, gymnastics rings in a gymnastics class setting. And the defendant was liable for 2 reasons: failure to provide adequate matting and failure to supervise. And what they said in this case was the standard of care required of a coach is that of a careful and prudent parent. Very, very high standard. I'm going to pick on Josh and his daughter because this is a great example. Thank you for bringing her. Where Josh would be taking care of his daughter far to a higher standard than we would as a coach. But that's what the court said in 1981, and this decision has not been overturned in 40 years. So when you're dealing with your athletes, you kind of have to think like you're their parent for those 2 hours they're in your program. Now, what we also learned from this case was the activity should meet the following 4 tests. Was the activity suitable for the participant's age and condition, physically and mentally? And I always like to talk about diving. Is the participant progressively trained? We talk about diving. We don't send them to the 10-meter platform. We start off with the side of the pool, and then we go to the 1 meter, the 3 meter, the 5 meter, the 10 meter. And you'd want to apply those same principles with the sport of pentathlon. I get that's tricky because you're dealing with so many different disciplines, but these principles are unilateral across the sports sector. Make sure your equipment is adequate and suitable, and the performance is properly supervised. There was a case just recently, it was a concussion case actually, where a field hockey player had missed 2 weeks of lessons. Showed up after 2 weeks. Teacher said, hey, here's what you've missed. Basically said, don't stand behind anybody when they're swinging the stick. And of course, the kid got hit in the head, had a bit of some damage, and they went to court. And the teacher said, I told him what to do. I told him not to stand there. And of course, the judge said, well, 2 weeks of lessons does not equate to 30 minutes of preconditions before you go play. So make sure it's properly supervised and you're progressively trained. There's a second case from 1989, but it's a lower level court. It's from the BC Appeals Court, where an athlete was rendered a quadriplegic when the scrum in a rugby collapsed and the individual unfortunately broke his neck and sued the coach for mismatching athletes in the prop position. Now, in this case, they didn't say the test is what would a careful and a prudent person do. They said, what would an ordinary coach have done in a similar circumstance? And the test of the coach was to apply the laws of the game and act in accordance with a coach of similar skill and care. So I've got this standard of a very high standard of you're a careful and prudent parent. Then I've got this BC Court of Appeal decision that says you're a careful and prudent coach. And really the way we should be looking at this, in my perspective, is yes, we have to keep that Supreme Court of Canada decision high, but as athletes become better, experienced, more high performance, we're moving down from their parent and more into their coach role. So just want to keep you that from an educational perspective of understanding what that standard is. And we are going to kind of flip this in a second into concussion management. You're a coach, someone gets a concussion in your program. What are you going to do? You will be looking at somewhere between being their parent and being their coach. Now, as I said before, I want to be in this white box up there. Even though there might be a concussion, even though there might be damage, but I did everything reasonably possible to protect this individual, I'm in that white zone. Did you breach your standard of care? Remember the first thing we said, I need to say yes 4 times. Do I have a duty? Yes. Did I breach my standard of care? No. And that's what happened in that BC rugby case, was they actually said the coach was not liable because he had acted like a careful and reasonable coach in a similar circumstance. So that situation, you actually have a paraplegic athlete and the coach was found to be not liable, which is, of course, huge. So I want you to be in that white box. If I say yes to all 4 parts of the question, then I'm in the red box. That's when I call my insurance company, and they're going to be likely cutting a check to somebody. So let's pivot that into concussion safety. So I want to start with Ontario because it is have the highest standard for concussion management in our country. Now, depending on where your event is or where your club's located, you may be applicable to the Ontario laws, If not, it's still very important to know about them. As I said before, it starts to create the trends in the industry. So Rowan Stringer was a 17-year-old rugby player who died on May 12, 2013, and she was tackled and showed signs of headache and exhaustion and bags under her eyes. And it was believed that she never told parents, coaches, or any adults about her headaches. And rather than sitting out of the game, she decided to continue to play. I actually think she was the captain of the team. And I'm the captain. We got to go. We're gonna win this. And the cause of death was multiple head injuries. She returned to play after receiving an undiagnosed concussion and received a second concussion while playing again. So like I said before, rather than her parents suing everybody, they started advocating and lobbying for change in Ontario on concussion education and concussion management. The government mandated a coroner's inquest, and they had 49 recommendations. Of course, I didn't list all 49. I just listed a couple here. One was enhanced concussion awareness and treatment, head injury awareness and prevention, a removal from play protocol, return to play strategies, mandatory concussion curriculum. So again, more education and better tools for coaches and players to identify and treat concussions. After the coroner's recommendations were established, a committee was established involving medical doctors as well as people within the sporting system. I know a couple people who did sit on the committee. And shortly after that, a recommendation was made to the legislation for an updated code of conduct specifically related to concussions, mandatory collection of data. There was very little data on concussion management in sport and the actual numbers that were accruing. They wanted that information to be shared amongst the sport delivery partners with the consent of an athlete. They want this is the big one and probably the most onerous, one person present at all games and practices in addition to coaches who have specific training in concussion identification and management. It's basically they wanted to have a concussion spotter on place, on field. They wanted coaches to complete annual training, and they did not find sufficient evidence to support a recommendation for baseline testing. I don't hear much about baseline testing anymore, but it was something that was quite popular a couple years ago, was to go spend a whack of money and get a brain reading image, and that's kind of changed from what I understand. So in 2018, Rowan's Law received royal assent, and it's going to be and has been implemented in stages. As of July 1st, 2019, Rowan's Law became mandatory for sport in the public, private, and school-based systems, so provincial, local level sport, as well as any other activity within in Ontario. And the requirements effective in 2019 were mandatory education, mandatory immediate removal, and a return to play guidelines, a progressive chart to look at how people return to sport after getting a concussion. So organizations must now have parents and participants and administrators sign a code of conduct specific to concussions. They have to have those participants review concussion resources. And by July 1st, 2020, I can establish a sport-specific removal from sport and return to sport protocols. And yes, we have done this work in Pentathlon, and Shelley will address that when I'm done yapping. So what does an organization have to do? They have to have a concussion code of conduct signed by all participants under the age of 26, by their parents for under the age of 18, and all coaches, team trainers, and managers who interact with individuals younger than 26. Where we're seeing this added is really on the point of registration. We're seeing it added to the registration form. And that way, when people sign off on the registration, they're also signing these additional documents to check the boxes required by Rowan's Law in Ontario. There are lots of government templates. So if you are looking for resources, as I said before, take a look at Parachute Canada. excuse me, as well as just do a Google search for Rowan's Law, and you will see lots of templates that have been put out by the Ontario government with respect to how to prevent concussions, health and safety precautions, concussion symptoms, and recovery protocols. So there's a lot of resources. Do not feel you have to go out and recreate. The biggest thing that we would have to do as sport providers is know this exists and comply with the requirements that are mandated. So there are resources online for age 10 and under, ages 11 to 14. And as we said before, those resources must be reviewed on an annual basis. And really the way of doing that, as I said before, is point of registration. Unless you're going to do it as a big group, you're going to be chasing wild herds, trying to rile them in. The return from sport and removal from sport protocol was actually extended to July 1st, 2021 because of COVID. And again, we're recommending the use of the government templates, or you can create a concussion policy. And again, we have done that for Pentathlon Canada. Shelley, again, will speak about it, where it's posted, how you can get access to it. And to suggest that you would need something different in your province or territory, unless you're in Ontario, would probably be not necessary. So the removal from sport protocol requires, and this is the big one, a dedicated person at events to monitor concussions. They have the responsibility to remove athletes, provide emergency action, inform parents, and record the incident. They also have to, they don't have to diagnose a concussion, but they have to use their common sense. And my son is 9 and he plays high level baseball. And 2 years ago, when they were allowed to play in Ontario, we're not doing much here these days, that's for sure, because of COVID. But 2 years ago, he was playing in a tournament and a center fielder took a line drive off one bounce into his forehead as an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old. And everybody in the entire field could see the individual was a little wobbly. They only had 9 players. So they got 3 outs and they went off the field and everybody batted and it was their time to take the field. And the center fielder came back out again. And I got to respect and admire the tournament organizer. He has seen what happened. He walked onto the field into center field and said to this 8-year-old, "How do you feel?" And the 8-year-old said, "Not very good." And the tournament organizer pulled him off the field and said, "You're done." The coach didn't take them out because they only had 9 players, meaning there would have been an empty spot on the field. You know, we're talking about issues in concussion management or concussion symptoms that could last a lifetime. So to suggest that we should save the U8 baseball tournament, you can know where that ranks on the priority scale of this individual's health. So again, I applaud the tournament organizer for doing so. And I'm sure the kid's okay, but I'm just really happy to see that the way it was managed. Once we've removed an athlete from sport, it's not up to us to decide when they come back. We leave that to medical practitioners. And again, I can't tell you the stupidity that comes through my office. We had a gymnastics athlete, high level gymnast, got a concussion, 14 years of age. Mom's dying to get the kid back into practice. And the club says, look, when your doctor clears you, you can come back and get a medical note saying little Jennifer can come back, and we're more than happy to take her. We're not concussion experts. We're not medical experts. When the doctor says she's ready, we'll take her. So the next day, a letter shows up from an ophthalmologist. And I have to really give the ophthalmologist credit because the letter said, after examining little Jennifer's eyes, I do not see signs of concussion. I was like, good for you. He stayed within his jurisdiction. He did not go anywhere near the brain. So, of course, we ended up going back to the mother and saying, thank you for your eye doctor's letter, but this doesn't quite cut it. And you need to get something from a sport physician or a GP or somebody with concussion expertise. So that's why we say, get the diagnosis and then prepare that graduated return to sport activities based on the advice of a medical professional. And then once we do that, we record it, and to make sure we talk about the progressive steps in in line with medical advice that we've ascertained. That designated person we spoke about, to be honest with you, is the one probably big concern that I have, is to have this person at every practice and every game. I think can be very onerous. Excuse me, but they have the responsibility of removing a participant from competition. There's zero tolerance. If there's a suspected concussion, you pull them out. If there is a head injury, we take them out. Training is not required. Making a judgment call is. You will be reviewed. You have to review the concussion resources. And again, you're not acting as a physician or making a diagnosis. You're like that tournament organizer at my kid's tournament saying, man, I just saw you two smash heads or take a line drive to the forehead. You're out. You have to take the role seriously, always assume the worst, and of course, no competition as important as potential a lifetime of disability if we have the ability to protect that. And again, a lot of the safe sport complaints that are coming across my desk, I had a concussion and you didn't let me sit out, you put me back in, you made me continue to train. We see that quite often, unfortunately. On the registration form, as I said before, I think that's really where you get your key point of contact. Have the resources, concussion awareness resources available, particularly if you have the ability to use online registration. Embed those links, make them click those links, make them take that training, make them recognize a sign for concussion, have them sign the code of conduct and a brief description of a removal from sport and return to sport protocol so they understand that what they need to do. Update your registration forms, as I said, include those links to concussion awareness, links to concussion codes of conducts, and indicate their agreement that they have signed the code. And again, don't go recreate this stuff. It exists through Rowan's Law website, it exists through Parachute Canada, and it exists through the Pentathlon Canada protocols that we've helped create. As I said, I'm getting ahead of myself. Most the practical implementation will be challenging. I get that, but most of the materials have been developed. And again, you can see some of the examples we've stolen from some other PTOs with Swim Ontario talking about their application forms that they use. And as I said, keep an online form. And record keeping is vital, right? Particularly when we go back to that negligence claim. What did you do before you let Steve participate in your sport? Well, he signed off on the concussion education pieces. He signed off on the code of conduct. He recognized the return to play protocols. And we tried to educate Steve as best as we could about the risks of playing our sport and the likelihood of getting a concussion and what that means. So in the Pentathlon Canada concussion policies, we developed a guide for the management of participants who may have a suspected concussion as a result of a PC activity. The protocols and policies were adapted, as I said before, from the Canadian Guidelines on Concussion in Sport published by Parachute Canada. And the protocols and policies also recognize the additional requirements required by Rowan's Law, which we just spoke about. What's some of the key points of the protocol? It's intended to be used by all individuals who interact with participants in the context of a PC activity. Now, I'm looking at this through the lens of Pentathlon Canada. You all being here today might be looking at this through the lens of your club or your team or your athletes or your provincial or territorial sport body. So when you get those documents, you look at those policies, make sure the application and the jurisdiction is appropriate for your circle of responsibilities. But please don't go, as I said before, to rewrite this stuff. Take what the work that's been done, and you might have to edit it a little bit to work your organization. We want to have preseason concussion education. So again, what's the definition of concussion? What are the signs and symptoms? Some steps to prevent concussions. Steps when someone has suffered a concussion and returned to sport protocol. Of course, what are the sport recognition, head injury recognition? Again, fairly common sense stuff. You see somebody get hit in the head, neck, body, or there's neck pain, there's double vision, weakness or tingling, headache, seizure, loss of consciousness or vomiting. Again, you see any of these things, err on the side of caution. Err on the side of caution. I'll share a sad story with you, but I think it's relevant to kind of what I'm talking about here. Years ago, I was involved in a sexual assault between a 16-year-old athlete and a coach. And I met with the parents and I met with the parents and the victim and the sport organization, and we were trying to explain the options available to the young woman about going to the police and filing a complaint within the sport association. And the reply that I got from the father was, "Is this going to impact her Olympic selection?" And I was really mortified by that. Shelly and I have spent a lot of time together, working together, and I think she probably has a sense of me that I'm very here, always pretty even keeled. Takes a lot to get me to go up or down. And I think at the time my kids were, 4 and 2, very young at the time of this incident. And I was thinking about, well, if this was my daughter, what would my reaction be? And I stopped and I said to the father, I said, I'm happy to answer your question, but aren't you more concerned about your daughter's next 80 years of her life after being sexually assaulted by an older gentleman? And his response to me was, well, how is this going to affect her Olympic selection? And that's why we need people like us to be able to say, you just got hit in the head really hard. You're not going back in. And yes, this is for the provincial title or the national title, but I'm really concerned more about the next 80 years of your life. And that's really what stuff is about. So I do hope people recognize that. I'm sorry that story is harsh. It is, but it really, caught me at home here, and just the mentality that we have in sports sometimes just is a bit short-sighted. So again, we see these symptoms, get people out. While we talked about return to play, it's about slow and steady, again, on the recommendations of a doctor. Daily activities. Can they go to school? Can they go to work? Are they still having symptoms, headaches, sitting in dark rooms, not being able to look at monitors? And if they are, great. Now let's talk about moving to light aerobic activity. Start on an exercise bike at a very low pace and try that for 20 minutes and let's see how you feel. Well, I'm starting to feel nauseous again. Okay, well, we're going too fast. Once they have the ability to do the light aerobic, look into sport-specific exercises, get them back into training, right? Then we, of course, move into non-contact training, full contact practice, and then return to sport. So those are then short, the return to play protocols. But as I said before, really should be directed on a step-by-step basis by a medical practitioner. Shelly, you're up.
Unmute myself. Thanks, Steve. So Steve's been talking about some of the work we've done around concussion protocols. So I just wanted to let everybody know that we've created a Safe Sport website page. And, this is all going to be shared with you in terms of links, but you can find anything on Safe Sport there, including all of our concussion pieces. So we do have that national concussion protocol that Steve's talking about, and that is about that recognition, medical diagnosis, management. So that is all there, as well as our policy. And then one of the things the governance committee came up with, and it builds a lot on what Steve was saying about how do you actually get people to read this? How do you actually ensure that, that people are educated and there's awareness? And really, we have that policy acknowledgement form that can go with your registration that has people say, that they've actually read these things and they acknowledge what that means. So all of that is there. Right now, it's sitting there in a PDF format, but if anybody ever wanted it in a Word format because you just want to change the name of your organization or your club or adapt it in some way, by all means, please just ask me for it and I'd be happy to share it. Okay, back to you, Steve.
All right, I'm ahead of schedule, so I think yeah. Any questions or comments, and if not, while you guys are thinking, maybe I could actually open these documents. You see that? Yeah, Shelly, can you see that? Maybe make it a bit bigger. You can see the Pentathlon Canada stuff that we've been talking about here: preseason education, head injury recognition, removal from sport, emergency medical assessment tools, concussion management. Here's the return to school and return to sports strategies. And then, of course, there's the pathways there. So I'm not going to go into each one, but you can see that. Bear with me. I know this is, let me go to the other one. And then here's the actual policy. So the protocol, which would be this one, let's call this education. This is something that's probably more for you guys as sport providers than it would be for athletes. Of course, it's a great educational piece, but the concussion policy is really about, okay, what am I looking for? I've seen one, I've seen a symptom. How do I get rid of them? What do I do? How do I report it here in Ontario? And again, you might want to adapt these policies into your own PTO or your own club. That's really up to you. Here in Ontario, particularly, you can see for Ontario only, 7, 8, 9, there's a whole section here just specific to Ontario. So again, both documents are very relevant and good educational pieces, and again, comes with a lot of the stuff that we spoke about. Here's the concussion code of conduct, and it speaks about what each person has to understand, sign, and acknowledge, okay? I won't read you guys. You can find them on, as Shelley said, on the Pentathlon Canada website. I'm going to, what am I going to do here? Put this back. Are there any questions or comments or concerns or stories that you want to share? All of the above would be absolutely great. So share away with small group.
Steve, thank you. Really good content. So thank you for taking the time again. I'm curious about risk in situations where an incident happens outside of club training or national team training or the typical PC environment. And maybe it hasn't been shared by a parent or potentially by the athlete if they're age of majority. What risks may exist there? Because likely we don't have experts that are going to be able to identify. I mean, in certain instances, of course, we could identify if somebody's acting a little bit different and some of the other indicators, but are there risks to be aware of if it happens externally and then the athlete is stepping back into the normal training environment?
Yeah, it's a big problem, to be honest, Josh, and great question. It's a big problem, particularly in the martial arts world. There's a lot of people who are doing boxing, who are doing taekwondo, MMA, mixed martial arts, and of course, boxing doesn't talk to taekwondo, doesn't talk to MMA. So we really rely on the athlete to disclose that information from a liability perspective, Josh, to suggest you should have known that somebody was concussed because it occurred outside of your jurisdiction. Of course, I'm going to say the answer is no, but I do think you'd have some responsibility if, I show up and I don't know, dizzy and, things like that. You'd have to recognize that once it becomes known to you. Would I say it's common practice to, at the beginning of every practice to say, how's everyone feeling? Does anyone have concussion symptoms? Probably not yet, but I don't see that crossover liability occurring. If we know about it, we have an obligation to deal with it. If we don't, then I'd say we don't.
Okay, thank you. And secondly, this one's probably an easier one. It sounds like every single time that there's a concussion incident and the athlete's going through the return to play process, that the organization should get a letter confirming that they are able to return back to play.
Absolutely. I'd highly recommend that I think there's 6 return to play steps. I would highly recommend a doctor's note for each one. Again, because I don't want you or me or anybody on this call who's not a medical professional to start deciding that, oh, it's okay, Shelley, why don't you go do a 10K run uphill, right? I would rather the doctors make that distinguishment as we go through the process. And I told you my funny story, but it is true that people will do anything sometimes to get back. Go ahead, Josh. I know you had another follow-up.
No, that's it. Just confirming that it should be in writing. Because I will say in the past, we've most often relied on a parent coming to practice, making a phone call or sending an email saying our doctor has cleared this athlete and they're able to return. And we've probably somewhat naively said, okay, great, tell us a little bit more. What did they share? But we've sort of left it at that. So.
Yeah, and again, I hear you. I mean, you know, I recognize that a lot of the things that I preach about, it's very easy for me to tell you to go get 6 doctor's notes before somebody returns back to full practice or full competition. You know, I'd say that's best practice. If you can do it, I'd highly recommend it. I don't know. It's hard sometimes, you know. I always like to tell you should, you know, when you screen people, you should do a police record check, a vulnerable check, check their references, orientate them, and then do a follow-up interview. You know, and people look at me like, are you crazy, Steve? That's 20 hours per person in our organization. I'm like, I know. I did get one question online. It might have been sent privately to me or not. I think everyone might have gotten it. How does a doctor or medical professional determine a concussed person is now okay to return to sport? Has anything been standardized? I don't think so from a standardization perspective. Obviously, I believe doctors have their own tests and protocol to just say whether they're showing signs or symptoms or things like that. But I don't think there's a test. But again, outside of my jurisdiction. Pauline, you have your camera. Yeah, go ahead. I can't hear you. Go ahead. Pauline, sorry, we can't hear you.
Yeah, are you muted?
It says you're not muted, but we can't hear you.
Is it muted on the laptop? You can type your question in the chat to Pauline. We can ask it for you.
In the what?
The chat.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, is that SC? Sorry, your full name isn't coming up. Sorry. Okay, Sandra, did you have a question?
Oh God, no! I'm just trying to figure out what buttons to push.
Okay, no worries. Okay, Pauline, you can type it in the chat, or I don't know why it isn't coming up. Okay, while Pauline's getting her question together, does anyone have any other questions?
Sorry, it's Sandra. You were saying you're going to make like the slideshow available. Are you going to email them to us? Like, will it show up that I can just click and refer to it, or do I have to go somewhere?
Shelley, I'm going to send it to you, and then
Yep.
you have it. It's in your inbox.
Yep, I'll be able to send it to you. That's absolutely no problem.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, Joanne, did you have a question?
Oh. Oops, come here. Sorry, can you guys hear me? I wasn't sure whether I'd managed to unmute myself.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so playing devil's advocate, the story of the gymnast and the ophthalmologist, what I was expecting you to say was that they'd gone and signed up with another club and shown up from an activity when you knew that. So what do you do as an organizer when you know the child or the athlete is compromised, but they're not technically in your direct line of responsibility?
So if they're like participating in another sport, possibly?
Yeah, another sport, yeah. Or you know they've gone, so you know that you've excluded them, but now they've gone and signed up with your competitor / friend down the road.
Yeah.
And probably haven't disclosed.
That's a really good
What's
question.
your duty of care?
Yeah, it's not your, I'm not thinking so much about your duty of care. I'm thinking about your privacy obligations and your ability to share that Steve got a concussion. We don't have a return to play protocol signed. There is an exception in the privacy legislation that says, you can disclose personal information if it's in the best interest of the individual. So, you would take a bit of a legal risk relying on that exception to disclose, health information to a third party. To suggest that you would have a duty of care or responsibility to make sure Steve's not an idiot because he's, participating in 2 clubs with concussion symptoms, I'd probably say the answer is no from a legal perspective. Of course, legal perspectives don't always align with ethical perspectives. Good legal answer there, right, Joanne?
It is, I think from an ethical perspective, maybe appealing to the athlete and even their parents, since they were once your athlete and in your club, might be something to do there, just in terms of saying, is it really wise for you? First of all, you're leaving our club, that's your prerogative, but is it really wise for this person to be playing right now without a return to play letter and that kind of thing? So, Steve, could you not kind of appeal to the athlete and the parents directly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for sure I would do that, Shelley. You're right. That's probably the safest mechanism because there's no breach of privacy in that concern. And let the parents make an informed decision, which they should be anyway. But I like that as a first step before going down to the other club.
Now, Pauline, are you able to ask your question? I know we can't hear you, but maybe you can type it. No.
Her camera's gone now too.
Yeah, we got her twice here.
Oh yeah, I see that.
Yeah. Rachel, I know I'm going to put you on the spot here, but I know that you've been, you were part of the governance committee working on the concussion policies and protocols. Just wondered if there was anything that you wanted to ask Steve or anything you wanted to mention to the group, just in terms of good best practice.
No, just how thoroughly everything was gone through and how much expertise Steve brings to the table was really helpful. And I feel really confident that this is latest and greatest and puts us at a good level of coverage and making sure that we're practicing what is safest for the kids and athletes. So yeah, no, it was a very thorough process to be involved in for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I mean, look, it's interesting. If we were to summarize, an hour presentation into one line, would be simply err on the side of caution. We're not medical practitioners, but we're also not idiots, right? So if we think we have a suspected concussion, you pull that athlete, could be a coach, could be anybody for that matter, you pull that person, and yeah, it might be an inconvenience for them to go get checked out and to say, there are no signs of concussion. Well, I'd rather defer on that side than, somebody has a lifetime of ailment or issues that we could have possibly prevented. So err on the side of caution, use your common sense, and I think you'll be pretty good.
Great. Pauline, can we hear you now?
Hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Well, my question is this. Equestrian Canada regulates all the equestrian sports, not including pentathlon. In Equestrian Canada, if you fall off a horse, you're done for the day, right? The way pentathlon is set up through the mother UIPM organization is that you fall off a horse, you can get back on and finish the course. So I'm especially concerned about that aspect of the sport when it relates to Rowan's Law and everything, right? Because if once they fall off, then they're allowed to get back on and finish the course, right? And the clock keeps ticking while they're actually trying to get back on the horse. So the whole concussion policy in regards to the equestrian way that pentathlon works is a little bit disconcerting for me.
Yeah, and I'll say this, Pauline, like obviously I'm not going to get too much in the rules of pentathlon and your international federation that likely sets those rules, but I will say, again, from a legal perspective, so if a pentathlete falls off their horse, gets back on it, and finishes the race, and then we discover they had a concussion, and because they finished the race, it caused additional damage. Am I going to, as a litigation lawyer, pull out Equestrian Canada standards and say, well, why is it that they say you can't continue, but in pentathlon you can? I think it's definitely of concern, of issue, something, Bobby, to review. I don't have the answer to what happens at the international level and how they create their rules. But yeah, I think there's a gap there that should be looked at. That's for sure.
It could be maybe that we make them stop and then we stop the clock and then get them assessed. And then, I don't know, that's a Pentathlon Canada question, really. How we want to approach that given the Canadian rules on the subject of concussion.
And Pauline, I think that we could create a rule, like that rule, and I think that that would be something we could do. One of the issues, I think, and this, Steve, you must know this from most international sport, is if you have a higher standard coming out of your country, but the international level does not, what trumps what?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, on that particular issue, Shelley, I doubt your international federation would probably care if we stopped and assessed and redid things. I mean, look, the this is again another terrible example, but just recently the International Rugby Federation, speaking of transgendered athletes, went back basically 40 years ago. You have to have the physical genitalia to match your gender identity, which here in Canada would lead you 100% into litigation, to which you would lose, where gender identity and gender expression is protected by human rights legislation. So to suggest, did I get a call from Rugby Canada saying, well, IF is saying this and Law in Canada is saying that, what do we do? Yes, I had that conversation and said, look, at a national level, to what we control it. But yeah, we'd probably have to tell a transgendered athlete that they're not eligible to play international competition. But that's the international rule, right? So do I think we could amend that? Yeah, I do.
I think it's something your next Pentathlon Canada board meeting should be maybe.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that Canada always has a role at any international table as well to advocate for stronger practices and safer practices for athletes. And, that's something that we should really be doing as well. Great. Frey, did you put your camera on? Do you have a question?
You bring the horses in?
No, you're just saying hi out there. Awesome. Awesome. So does anyone else have any questions for Steve or anything about concussions or anything else? All right. Well, then we've reached just about the end of our time. So I'll give Steve the last word, but I really do want to thank him and thank everybody for coming on this call. It was a great discussion, and I think we've brought up some really interesting things to make our sports safer. There's some good documents out there that we can all use, and there's even more with Parachute and things like that. So we're going to add some links to the Safe Sports site. Pauline, I'll work with you and George on that. And I think that at our next board meeting, we should really talk about some of these safety pieces as well. So that'll be great.
Thank you.
My pleasure, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you for giving me your time, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, now what? So if you push that,